Hello, today we're going to be talking about the implications of high savings in China. And we're going to be looking at this article in the OneNote document. Please go through and read it first, and then come back to this video. Okay, once we've done that, we'll just take a quick look at some of the diagrams here, and quite interesting what's going on in China as different to other consumption-led economies. So China here clearly has over 40% of GDP as gross domestic savings, and compared to what are known as consumer-led economies, US and UK are looking at around about half that. So that is what we're going to try and do today is compare the economies of the US and the UK and China, and look at what difference that makes in terms of these economies and their outcomes. If we flick on, we can see that in China we have high amounts of fixed investment. This is this line here, and again over 40% of GDP. And again in the US and the UK, we're looking at around about half that amount of investment. Now investment spending by firms on capital is very useful. We should remember that it shifts LRAS to the right. It shifts out your PPF, your productive potential, because capital is a factor of production. So this is the very basis of all long-term economic growth. Accompanied by it though, and what is really important is that it creates debt. So the debt that is created from investment has to be paid back. So these machines and this infrastructure that we are buying must therefore generate a return on investment, and we must be able to pay this debt back in order for this to be sustainable. And that is quite interesting in the current environment in China. And again, COVID is hitting the Chinese economy, and we're having impacts on the real estate market as well, which we'll go through later. Let's get into some theory and look at some of the implications of what we're talking about. So firstly, in order to understand some of this, we need to understand the relationship between consumption, that is domestic expenditure on domestic goods and services. So in China, consumption is Chinese consumers buying Chinese produced goods and services. If they're buying American goods and services, then that is an import. And saving. Now saving is where you take some of your income and you put it in the bank so you can use it later. Consumption and saving, therefore, are the inverse of each other. The higher the consumption in your economy, the lower the saving. So the UK and US, they're going to have high consumption and low saving. In China, because we have high saving, we have low consumption. So there's that relationship you see there. That takes us on to the theory of the multiplier. We know that the multiplier is 1 over 1 minus MPC. Now essentially, if you have an increase in your income, you can do 4 things with it. You can buy domestic goods and services, that's consumption. You can pay the government's tax. You can save it in a bank, or you can buy imports. They are the only things that you can do with those. And you'll notice that these STM are leakages from our economy, and they all make your multiplier smaller. Now in the context of China, China has very, very high saving, which then makes its consumption lower. Or put another way, because the marginal propensity to save in China is high, that means that the marginal propensity to withdraw is high, which must mean that the marginal propensity to consume is low. Therefore, if you have, for example, an injection. Now what injection does China have? Well, you could have the injections of exports, you could have investments, or government expenditure. And China has significant exports, investment and government expenditure. It's an export-led economy, which means if there's an export that comes into China, that creates an export injection, that goes to firms, who then pay that money to workers, and workers can decide whether to consume or save. Now the problem with it is in many countries, the exports would go to firms, go to workers, and workers would then take a significant proportion of that income and consume, and then that would go around your circular flow round and round and round like that, and creates a multiplier effect. However, in China, that export goes to firms, it goes to workers, and then less of it is consumed. So we have a smaller multiplier effect, whereas the other one goes into a pool of savings. And therefore, that we can say firstly then, the multiplier in China is going to be lower than the multiplier in, let's say, for example, the UK. So for example, if $1 of exports go into China, and the multiplier in China, for example, is 2, then as a result of the injection of $1, GDP will go up by $2. However, exports, for example, in the US are $1. It's got a multiplier of 4, then the GDP will be, from that, will be $4. So you can see straight away that the Chinese multiplier must be lower in China than it would be in other consumption-led economies. That's one problem with having a high savings rate. Let's take a look at the accelerator. The accelerator is an interesting theory that suggests that as consumption rises in an economy, you are going to see shifts to AD, and as a result, got my AD curve here, you're going to see an increase in economic growth. There. As a result, that increase in economic growth will result in further increases to the circular flow, and you're going to see profits for firms rising. So profits are going to rise. In anticipation of profits rising and AD shifting right, you are going to therefore need to invest to expand your business. And so you're going to see firms becoming more able and more willing to buy capital. And so they're going to start spending on capital. And so we can say then that from consumption, there is a link over to capital. And as a result, consumption will provoke investment expenditure. And as a result, that further shifts AD to the right, because investment is a component of AD. But it will also then shift LRAS out as well. Great. That is the traditional consumer-based economies way of growing. So you have low savings, which results in high levels of consumption, which boosts profits significantly for firms who become more willing and able to spend, which then drives capital investment, which then results in shifts to LRAS and AD, which then flow back then through into consumption as our incomes rise, generating this virtuous cycle of economic growth. However, in our government-led investment model, there's a bit of a problem, because we know that if we have high savings, we know that in China the savings are very high, then you're not going to get this accelerator effect. The accelerator effect in China is going to be low. But what you do get is a large pool of savings within banks. And banks can take these, and the government can then take those and invest them instead of the private sector. That's the government-led investment model. Now, if we look at this breakdown here, it's quite interesting. You can see that households saving large amounts of money will then result in savings going this way. Now, interestingly, what are households saving in China? Well, a significant saving requirement is for houses. Houses are very expensive. They've gone up significantly in recent years, and it's we have an income to house price ratio of around about 30. You're going to have to earn 30 years worth of income to buy your house. So significant amounts of savings have been saved and then deferred to later to go into real estate firms. Now, real estate firms have been expanding incredibly fast. And all land in China is owned by the government. So every time the real estate firm wants to build a new house, it has to buy land from the government in form of land sales. And that essentially is a massive tax. So you're seeing another an essentially different form of taxation going through savings, then through to tax. So you've got a double withdrawal from the circular flow. As a result, you are then seeing large pool of money in the government takes that and then spends it on investment spending and infrastructure spending as government spending and investment injections. As a result, what you then see is the injection back into the economy, and it's taken a route out. You can see this route by yellow. It's taken a route that's circumvented firms through the government and then directed back through that way. In the Western sort of consumption-led economy, you don't have so much savings. All of this consumption is going into firms, and those firms then take that profit and it's come out of firms, and there is a cycle back through into investment. That's the accelerator effect, driving it back into households again. And that's a really interesting thing. We're simply cycling profits or savings back into investment, but through a different vehicle, one being firms, the other being the governments. Right, I've got 10 minutes left. Okay, I don't think I'm going to be able to finish this. Right, that is interesting because that is great in your first part of your development model. So when China was very, very poor, it drove all of that investment into things like roads, critical infrastructure. Now, we know that the returns to critical infrastructure are very, very high. If you build a road, someone's going to use it. If you don't have any roads, if you don't have an electricity grid, if you build something, it's going to get used. It's basic critical infrastructure. But right now, China already has all of its basic critical infrastructure already built, and it's having a return on investment. You could think of the ROI, a percentage of your return, against quantity of investment. This is not a technical diagram, by the way, don't draw it. But what I'm seeing is an investment curve that looks like that. The first investment, that first road you build, you're getting, say, 20% return. Great, that's fantastic, it's very productive. But as we keep on expanding out our investment, the returns go down as we see diminishing marginal returns. As each additional project that we take on becomes more risky, it becomes slightly less useful, and therefore the government's going to struggle to direct it. What do you need then? Well, at this point here, it doesn't really matter which project you choose. They're all going to be good, and the government can choose them. But as I come down my curve, I'm going to need someone who probably has more information about the opportunity cost of my investment decision. Who has the most information? Not the government. It's not the government, it's individual firms. And so when you get to, the theory is, when you get to a higher level of development and a higher level of you have already built your critical infrastructure, you're going to need private firms to start to take over from the government in directing the allocation of investment funds. The real danger in China right now is that these allocated investment funds are not being allocated in an efficient manner, and if that's the case, the return on investment is going to plummet faster than if you were in a firm-based model. It's possible that your state-owned enterprises have a ROI curve, an investment curve that looks like that, a yield curve that looks like that. They're not directing it properly. And therefore you might claim that the future economic growth in the US is possibly higher trend than in China. Now the underpinnings of all of this model, as I said before, came from the real estate market. And this works if the real estate market is growing. We have seen that high house prices mean that as a result, you can see in my circular flow, if I can just get this one note to work, real estate firms here, the payments to government for land sales rely on a high house price. If that high house price crashes, then the whole investment model is going to crash. The next point, and fascinatingly, this is the most fascinating bit, I'm not going to get too much into this, is that the current account surplus in China, a lot of it is driven back into the domestic property market, but some of it, again, results in a global savings glut. That was the cause of the 2008 recession, and as a result, lots and lots of excess savings built up in Western banks. They lent it at low interest rates to the subprime mortgage market in the US. A lot of that was Chinese money, and as a result, they lent out lots of bad loans, and those loans did not perform and failed because there was a global savings glut. Therefore, that drove the current account deficits in places like the US, because the US then took that money and bought lots and lots of Chinese exports, driving the money back round to China again. So we find ourselves in a catch-22 situation where we have a savings ratio which is high and a real estate market which is booming. As those two things are driving each other, and driving this government investment model. As soon as any component of that collapses, we're going to see the need for individual private